This is part one of a topic that's going to span at least several weeks, maybe even several months, depends on how long it takes to get through each particular verse. But it is meant to be kind of a companion study to exploring the Shema discussions on the issues of Trinity that we concluded last year, 2022, which was a 3-year-long study based on a commentary that is available on my website at tetzetorah.com, as well as my congregational website at grafton.com. So we just finished segment 1, 60 minutes, Eschatology, a biblical study of end-time events, part 1. And if end-time prophecy interests you, well then catch the 1.5 hour long live internet study YouTube video and a podcast that gets uploaded near the end of each week, probably usually around Saturday sometime, Saturday morning or Saturday afternoon is when it goes live. It takes me a little while to do all the editing, but then you can listen. Otherwise, I break the segment 1 into 3 parts of Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, part 1, 2, and 3, that hour-long study of end-time eschatology. And then Thursday and Friday, I've dedicated to segment 2's 30-minute study on Trinitarian response to biblical Unitarianism. And so for those 2 days, Thursday and Friday, it will show up in my YouTube channel as part 1 of 2 and part 2 of 2, each being 15 minutes long. So let's jump now into this particular topic. Here's the way the format's going to work. I'm going to take biblicalunitarianism.com's website, which you have pulled up on your screen right now, and I'm going to take their answer to Trinitarian passages. They've got a webpage dedicated to common verses that they quote are the following clear explanations of the verses of the Bible that Trinitarians have sometimes used in attempts to prove, quote unquote, the Trinity and to substantiate that Jesus is God. But they say that there are an overwhelming number of very clear verses about Jesus' identity and his distinction from God, and since God's word has no contradictions, these comparatively few verses must fit with the many clear verses, and they do. So they assume a Unitarian, non-Trinitarian perspective of these passages. They believe that the entire Bible was written from a non-Trinitarian, that is to say, Unitarian perspective. So they believe that God is one, that he's numerically one, and that he is not tripart. He's not triune. And so that's why the website's kind of slogan is a website about God and his son, Jesus Christ. If you can see it in their little logo, their biblical Unitarianism. So if you look at this particular page, which we're going to use as our anchor, for the Old Testament, they've got about a little more than a dozen or so passages that normally Trinitarians would turn to for their support of Trinitarian theology. But biblical Unitarians going to come around and say, you're misunderstanding those passages. Let me tell you how it's truly a Unitarian passage. A Trinitarian passage. What I want to do as a Trinitarian Christian, as a Trinitarian believer, is I want to turn right back around and answer their answer. In other words, I want to provide a refutation or a response or a rebuttal, however you feel my answer is described. I want to provide an answer to bring us right back around to the Trinitarian perspective and say, I think the biblical Unitarian perspective has misread, misunderstood, misused, or misquoted the passage in question, all right? With the perspective of having a dialogue perhaps with biblical Unitarians and bring them into a more meaningful discussion on who and what God is and to better understand him. My aim is actually to find some common ground between biblical Unitarians, especially the believers, right? Not the liberal branch of Unitarianism, universal or whatever the other branch, but specifically biblical Unitarians who still believe in the validity of the Bible and are interested in dialoguing about God and his son Messiah with a view towards a genuine relationship towards God and with God and his son Yeshua and a dependency on the Spirit of God. My goal is to perhaps have a dialogue, an ongoing kind of dialogue with biblical Unitarians. However, this won't be what we might call debate. Eventually, I'd like to maybe bring on a biblical Unitarian, if schedule permits, and have maybe just an open discussion with him. But for now, we'll also be looking at New Testament passages. You can see there are quite a number of New Testament passages, easily more than 24 as I'm scrolling quickly down through them. You can see a lot of them in there. We'll be looking at each and every one of those passages in due time. But without further ado, let's jump into the first passage that they have, which is Genesis 1:1. And you can see on my screen a picture of one of the prominent YouTube and internet Bible teachers available today. The concept of biblical Unitarianism, the idea that God is not triune, dates all the way back to the 1st century when Trinitarian theologies were being challenged by Socinianism, by modalistic monarchianism, by Arianism, and things like that. So biblical Unitarianism or non-Trinitarian perspectives on the Bible are easily 2,000 years or older. If you're going to take the monotheistic perspective of Judaism, which dates back 3,500 years, and say that biblical Unitarianism agrees a lot with monotheistic Judaism, then we could say that Unitarianism is even 3,500 years old, but more recently it's properly to look at it as about 2,000 years old, being rooted in Socinianism, Arianism, and modalism and things like that. All right, so John Schoenheit, or Schoenheit, I'm not 100% sure how to pronounce his name because I can't find anyone who pronounces it, and he himself doesn't pronounce his name, but I think it's Schoenheit. That's his face right there that you see. But let's jump right back down and look at the first passage, which is Genesis 1:1. And we're going to take the next 30 minutes and begin to work our way through this passage. What I'm going to try and do, if their answers are short enough, is just simply read their answer first. That's the only way to fairly interact with their material so that I'm not misrepresenting them. So let's read their answer first, and then I'll supply my own very short answer, which doesn't take a lot of time to answer, I believe. Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. KJV. All right, here's what they have to say. It is sometimes argued that since the word God or Elohim is in the plural form, that therefore God is a trinity of persons. However, that is not how we should understand the usage of Elohim. Again, remember, this is the biblical Unitarian answer as presented by this particular gentleman, John Schoenheit or Schoenheit. In weeks to come, I'll see if I can do a better job of finding exactly how to pronounce his name. Or John, if you, Mr. Schoenheit, if you happen upon this particular video and you want to tell me how to pronounce your name, send me an email or drop me a comment to the video and tell me. Or if someone in YouTube land knows exactly how to pronounce his name, you're a biblical Unitarian or you're familiar with his teachings, and you know exactly how to pronounce it. Can you give me like what do we call one of those where you break down the pronunciation along the lines of its phonetic description and things like that, rhymes with whatever, something like that. All right, but he talks about how that when we read about Elohim in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Many Trinitarians, remember, he's working from the popular Trinitarian perspective, and he's refuting it. He's saying, no, you Trinitarians are misunderstanding the passage. Okay, so that's what we're working from. He says that this isn't how we should really understand the passage of Elohim, the word Elohim, as if it's a plural of people. Instead, he says we should understand that Elohim is the plural of majesty in Hebrew, meaning that the Jews would use the plural to magnify or exalt a single individual when the singular would not do justice. All right, that's his overview answer, his kind of short answer. And then he begins to flesh this out. Point number 1. And he's going to draw from resources from popular biblical Unitarians or non-Trinitarians, maybe people like authors like Bart Ehrman or what's his name? I'm drawing a blank. Very prominent anti-Trinitarian author. Let me scroll to the bottom of the page real quick and see if his name is mentioned, because I definitely want to quote him. I mean, I definitely want to make you aware of him. Yep, there he is. Anthony Buzzard. Yeah, like those birds that prey on dead flesh, buzzards. Yeah, okay, Anthony Buzzard. Really interesting last name there. No disrespect to Mr. Buzzard, just interesting name. So Anthony Buzzard is kind of a driving force of non-Trinitarian theology in the world today, in the internet land. A prominent spokesman for the non-Trinitarian perspective. So those of you who are non-Trinitarians are probably very familiar with his worldview and his view on Trinity. The word God, point number one, according to this particular author, again, Mr. Shainit or Shainite, the word, I'll just say according to biblical Unitarianism, the word God is Elohim, which itself is a plural form, and like most other words, has more than one definition. Therefore, it should not always be understood in the plural or always understood in the singular because of the way the Hebrew language uses plural nouns such as Elohim. He reminds us that context helps determine its usage. So far, I actually agree with what he's saying. I haven't determined whether or not I want to interact with their answers as I'm reading them, or whether I want to read down through the entire answer and then interact with it afterwards. But this first time, I'll try reading the entire answer and then going back and interacting with them. This way, at least I get to read all of the answer into the YouTube and iTunes podcast, YouTube video. Let me continue reading. Right, I'll try to resist the urge to stop and elaborate unless it's absolutely necessary, I believe, from my perspective. This author continues. This Unitarian author continues. Speaking of the term Elohim, it's used both in a plural sense of gods or, quote, men with authority, in a singular sense, for God with a capital G, God with a small g, or, quote, a man with authority, such as a judge, end quote. He continues, the Hebrew lexicon by Brown, Driver, and Briggs, considered to be one of the best available, has as its first usage for Elohim, and then here's a quote from that lexicon, rulers, judges, either as divine representatives at sacred places or as reflecting divine majesty and power, divine ones, superhuman beings, including God and angels. End quote. This author continues with his answer. Elohim is translated as gods with a small g in many verses. For instance, Genesis 35:2 reads, quote, get rid of all the foreign gods you have with you, small g. And Exodus 18:11 says, quote, now I know that the Lord is greater than all other gods, small g, end quote. It is translated judges in Exodus 21:6, 22:8 through 9. It's also translated angels from the KJV, or, quote, heavenly beings, end quote, in the NIV in Psalm 8, verse 5. These examples, the author reminds us, show that there are times when the plural form of Elohim should be understood as a normal plural. All right, which I agree with for the most part. Continuing, this author says, however, Elohim is also translated as the singular God with a small g, or, quote unquote, or judge, quote unquote, with a small j, and there's no hint of any, quote, compound nature or plurality when it is translated that way. An example he says is Exodus 22:20, which reads, quote, whoever sacrifices to any god, small g, other than the Lord must be destroyed, end quote. Another example is Judges 6:31, which reads, quote, if Baal really is God, it really is a god, small g, he can defend himself when someone breaks down his altar. End quote. The author continues. In Exodus 7:1, God says that he has made Moses a, quote, God with a small g, end quote, which he puts in brackets Elohim to Pharaoh. And he's reminding us that even though God says that he made Moses a God with a small g, the Hebrew term is Elohim. He's going to flesh out some more of the Hebrew here below. But God made Moses a God or an Elohim to Pharaoh, end quote. The author reminds us, he did not make Moses a gods to Pharaoh. And so he's reminding us that the word Elohim is in the plural. Those of you who know Hebrew, and he's going to remind us here in a moment, you can see instantly why it's plural. But there are times when the context warrants translating the word Elohim, even though it is plural, into a singular, not a plural, and where it should be translated as with a lowercase g rather than a capital G, right? It would really be weird if it said that God, capital G, says that he has made Moses a God, capital G, to Pharaoh. That would really be strange, right? It wouldn't fit the context. So this lowercase g in the singular seems to be the best interpretation there of that passage. The author reminds us, he did not make Moses gods to Pharaoh. Again, in Judges 11:24, the pagan god Chemosh is called Elohim, and in 1 Samuel 5:7, the pagan god Dagon is called Elohim. Yet Christians do not conclude that those gods, small g, were somehow composite or uniplural, quote unquote. Right? At least I've never heard Christians talk about how that these pagan gods, Chemosh or Chemosh, I have to look at the Hebrew to see how it's really pronounced, but Chemosh and Dagon are somehow uniplural, like God supposedly is, according to biblical Unitarian's perspective. Or he goes on to remind us that people who worship these false gods worship them, the people who worship them thought that they were uniplural. There's no indication of that in the text either. Therefore, according to this author, to see the Trinity in the plural of majesty in the word Elohim when it refers to the singular God of Israel, but not in these other uses of Elohim, is inconsistent in his perspective. He continues, point number 2. Some teach that the word Elohim implies a compound unity when it refers to the true God. Again, this is a Unitarian answer that is trying to refute the Trinitarian answer, right? When we're talking about Genesis 1:1, we're just looking at this first verse in their list of passages. This author continues, this particular perspective, this Trinitarian perspective, that God is a compound unity, this would mean that the word Elohim somehow changes meaning when it is applied to the true God, so that the true God can be a compound being. There's just no evidence of this, he says. The first place we should go for confirmation of this is to the Jews themselves. Notice he says the first place. I'll go back and comment on that later. When we studied history and the language of the Jews, we discovered that they never understood Elohim to imply a plurality in God in any way. In fact, the Jews were staunchly opposed to people and nations who tried to introduce any hint of more than one God into their culture. And then he has his part in bold, as you can see on my screen. Jewish rabbis have debated the law to the point of tedium and have recorded volume after volume of notes on the law, yet in all of their debates, there is no mention of a plurality in God. He continues, this fact in and of itself ought to close the argument. I'll address that a little bit later in our study here. No higher authority on the Hebrew language can be found, he continues, than the great Hebrew scholar Gesenius. And he's the one who wrote that originally authored one of the lexicons that we referenced earlier, the Brown Driver and Biggs Gesenius lexicon. Gesenius, I don't know if his name is still attached to the Brown Driver Biggs, the BDB anymore, but it used to be, at least the version I have on my bookshelf, has Gesenius' name on it. So let's quote the great Gesenius. This author quotes him. He wrote that the plural nature of Elohim was for intensification and was related to the plural of majesty and used for amplification. Gesenius states, quote, that the language has entirely rejected the idea of numerical plurality in Elohim whenever it denotes one God. Notice he says numerical plurality, and it's proved especially by its being almost invariably joined with a singular attribute. And the link there, the footnote there, points to Gesenius' lexicon. This author continues, in Hebrew, there are quite a few different examples in which the plural noun form is used in reference to a singular object. So listen to this. Bullet point number 1, the plural of extension. We have shamayim, which is translated from the Hebrew as the sky or the heavens. Notice the plural is used because the heavens are composed of multiple parts, but it's not referring to multiple heavens. We just say the heavens. The translations sometimes say sky, but sometimes they say heavens. Sometimes it just says heaven. Just depends on the translator. But the original Hebrew is plural. Bullet point number 2, plural of composition. We have damim, literally bloods. So we have a translation that's literally bloods, damim. The singular would be dam. The plural is used at times when we in English would use only the singular form of blood, but if we were actually go back and look at the Hebrew, then sometimes it's literally the word bloods, but it wouldn't make sense to the context, so we just translate it as blood in the singular. And then we have the plural of majesty, bullet point being shown on your screen right now. And this is the one that many of us are familiar with from the book of Genesis. point number 1 under this bullet point, Elohim, literally gods, is used of non-Israelite gods or the Israelite God, again in the singular. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. In the beginning, God, singular, Elohim, created the heavens and the earth. We have the word shamayim in there as well. So, Bereshit bara Elohim, in the beginning, created God. If I were to translate it woodenly, Bereshit, in the beginning, bara Elohim, bara created, and then Elohim, God. We don't translate it as gods in plural. That would probably not be the message that Moshe was trying to convey when he penned that particular verse.